Julia's presentation is entitled Learning Driven Leadership and Learning as the Heart of Leadership. And that's so much out of my hymn book, Julia, that I'm very much looking forward to your presentation. Could you please welcome Julia Atkin to the microphone?
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Bob. And I don't know whether you're still here, David, but a hard act to follow. And I want to actually pick up, though, one thing from it is that a story I tell about a student that I met a long time ago when ICT was first being used in classrooms. And I walked into a room and the school had asked me to come and have a look at what they were doing and what they were doing with technology and how the kids were operating and whatever. And when I got there was a little boy outside with his mother obviously high on drugs, explaining why, whatever. The boy looking very embarrassed and just wanting to slink into the classroom with his mates and whatever. Anyway, he eventually came into the room where I went on to then have a look at what was going on. And he sat down and started working, and I guess whatever he was working on, I didn't really know what he was doing. The other kids were doing all sorts of things with technology. And I went over to him after a while and sat down. I said to him, can you tell me what you're doing? And he said, I'm doing the title page for this stuff we're doing on the human body. And I said, I'm really interested to see that you're actually drawing, where you could do the title page on the computer like the other kids are doing. So can you explain to me why you've chosen to draw? He says, well, I can do it on computer, but the trouble with that is I don't get the feeling I get when I draw. And so much as I am a great and sort of very enamoured and a great user, I've always been a great user of technology, I guess the thing that Prothemius's little quote at the end for me is about also being mindful of the human qualities that are about the things that people love to do, like the drawing or whatever it is, that you may be able to do with technology, but it doesn't have quite that same human element. The other thing I'm noticing around schools, and it's again not to go against what David's saying at all, it's actually because I'm probably often talking in the same vein about where we need to be going and what we need to be thinking about with the kids we're working with. But one of the things that I'm noticing around schools a lot is that fewer kids are actually using technology in schools. You might think that's a bit of a weird thing, but what I'm finding is that whereas probably when in my primary school days, for most kids, going to school was exciting because it had more than home. What I'm finding these days is kids often get their technology feel like Hudson and co at home, and what they're looking for more at school is the rich collaboration they can get socially and that they're actually interacting with people. So much as I thought, oh my God, fancy having to talk after that because it'll seem like it's really coming down to earth. In some ways, I think it's quite a good antidote to keep us thinking about, to me, what is learning is the heart of, and I'm going to add, authentic leadership. Because we can have all sorts of leadership. Dictatorship is a form of leadership. But if we want authentic, educative leadership, what's all that about? And for me, the message, and again, just in response or following on from David's talk, it's really about stopping and looking back and saying, stopping and reflecting and saying, what do we really value? So it made me think a lot about this MC Escher print that I often use to talk about the nature of the transformation that the world's going through. And of course, most of us grew up in a fairly stable, unchanging sort of world or slow to change world. And in our sort of years of teaching, and some of you are a lot younger, so for you it may be well and truly up there into the middle and beyond where you sort of grew up with it being like that. But for a lot of us, the transformation has been quite considerable. And worldwide, I reckon we're struggling to try and get clarity and acceptance about what this new era is. And just as you think you've got a handle on it, of course it changes. Those photos that David showed about showing what happened in, say, 10 years or 5 years sometimes is extraordinarily fast in terms of what's happening and how it's changing. So for us to think deeply about what the curriculum needs to be, what the design for that and pedagogy and what are the facilities we're working in, how do we actually design education in a world that's rapidly changing? And that's where I come back to my anchor point, I guess, and they're my navigation aids for keeping true north. My navigation aids are, I reckon our navigation aids are our values, our beliefs about leadership and learning, clarity of our purpose as educators, open-mindedness and imagination, critical reflection on what we're doing and how we're helping kids, and dialogue. And I'd really like to add, and I think this is really tuning in again to where David's talk was going, it's dialogue with kids as much as with each other. How are they helping us shape their future, or how are we doing it in partnership? So if I come back to the little abstract I gave, heart, the heart of leadership, for me it implies emotion, motivation, motive. So I think one of the things, and sort of probably on a more serious note for you as you go through the conference, is to think as an educator and a leader, what are your motives? Why do you educate? Why do you lead? What is at the heart of your leadership? And so I'm hoping that what I take you through a little bit this afternoon will help you reflect on those questions and take quite a deep reflective moment. It's a great place to be, to have some time walking by the harbour and around, to think a little bit more deeply about some of those things, that why you educate, why you lead, and what's at the heart of your leadership. But I want to share a story. I was sort of trying to think in 20 minutes, like what if the last 30 years of working, like I first spoke at Hobart at a conference in 1991 when they were just launching, or you were just launching, for those of you from Tasmania, Our Children, the Future. So in 1991, that document was launched, and it was probably one of the first documents in Australia to start talking about learning. And it was right up the sort of the work that I'd been doing in my own research work, and then coming back into schools to try and do something about it. So at the heart of authentic educative leadership for me, where's all that sort of focus come from for me in terms of leadership? Well, it started way back in 1981, actually, before I was here in Hobart. And it was my first year high school teaching. And it was in Canberra. I'd come back from overseas without a dip ed. I had a PhD in how kids learn and think, but I didn't have a dip ed. I come back to teach in Australia and I wasn't able to get a job in a state school because I didn't have a dip ed. I could have taught the dip ed, but because I didn't have a dip ed, then I couldn't teach in schools. Crazy. Anyway, one of the independent schools in Canberra employed me for the first year I was there. And here I was, young, enthusiastic, passionate about learning and what I wanted learning to be for the kids, because most of my high school years I'd spent in the corridor. So I go into my Year 9 science class, and being late back in the school year, I had the waggiest class of boys in the school, and no one else wanted to teach them, so Miss X, who was coming later, was the one that got landed with this Year 9 class of boys. And I tried something with them the first day that I'd coming from university teaching to try and teach Year 9, and there was a big bit of a shift, as you can imagine. And I'm trying to work out how to design this learning experience for the kids, and it didn't go very well at all, sort of stunned mullet faces. And I thought, that's no good. So I went home and I thought about it, and I thought, well, hang on, what can I really do that gets them so engaged that they learn it without me having to do anything really? So what's the experience I want to create for them? So I went in the next day, taking quite a risk, because these kids really were the worst behaved class in the school, and they were pretty quick to tell you what they thought of what was going on. Anyway, so I tried this thing with them, this activity I'd designed, and I was blown away, because they were far more engaged than I expected. They asked far deeper questions than I expected. And it was just an absolute buzz to see what was happening for the kids. So I went up to the staff room afterwards to have morning tea, and I'd never been in a secondary school staff room before, so I didn't really know much what they were like. And went in, sat down. Whoever was unlucky enough to sit next to me got this ear bashing about how fantastic this was and blah, 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 blah. And most of them were, the woman next to me looked as if she was listening and was quite polite. But there was a guy sitting opposite me reading the paper. And after about 5 minutes, he said, "You won't last." And the paper went up again. And it was the beginning of my brush with teacher cynicism. And I thought, wow, where's that coming from? And why is that like that? I've never found it as rampant in primary schools as I have in secondary, but it's there. And it led me to describing it as a been there, done that syndrome. And it was been there, done that, didn't work, was usually added on the end. And I started to try and understand what is going on that people have that cynicism. They go into teaching for something more than this sort of browned off cynicism. So what is it that's going on? And then I started to realise that what was going on was that most of what they were doing or thought they had to do in their classrooms was coming from outside of their heart. It wasn't coming from them. It was coming from policymakers. It was coming from academics who were arguing with another academic in order to sort of put their case over this one. And so what you actually had in education was these incredible pendulum swings. We go all the way over here for a while, and someone says, no, that's not right. We go all the way back over here for a while, no, that's not right, and we go back again. And you get people like someone here in Tassie said to me around that time actually, they said, well, I've got a good way of dealing with that. And I said, what's that? And they said, I just put my head down and duck. And said, the only trouble is now the waves are coming so fast that I find that I can't come up for air. And someone else said, well, I just stand still because if I stand still long enough, it'll come back to where I am. And that sort of cynicism's been around for a while. Now, I used to point the finger mainly at policymakers and academics who are arguing, but actually I also point the finger very strongly at us as educators. And that's the bit that I want to really try and encourage you to have the courage to address. And that is about going deeply into what you value and believe about learning and what you're trying to do for learners. Most of what's gone on is we've had pressure not about the why and the how, we've actually focused on the what. And we've been told to do the what by everybody else other than our own understandings and intuitions. And so we've had this sort of outside pressure. And Pedro was getting at this morning. So how do you have the courage to stand up against the expectations that you will have the high NAPLAN scores that are going to stand out on my school? Are you going to actually continue to sacrifice the richness and amazing learning that kids can do because you're worried about their NAPLAN results? If you design well, they'll get better NAPLAN results anyway for good learning, for deep learning. And so the trouble with our focus on the what is it's led to a knee-jerk reaction, get the monkey off my back, and tick it off mentality. And a lot of you will say, yeah, well, you know, I don't do that, etc. Except one of my questions would be, if you, and I'm going to jump to another slide for a sec, because I'm probably doing this out of a bit different order. If you were to look at any of these things, and I'm going to put up here now, how many of these things have become the focus of your attention in school? Learning intentions on the board, 4-minute walkthroughs. We're an inquiry school. What's the effect size of that? Success criteria, DOL school, MLEs and MLPs, IEPs and ILPs. How much of the talk in your school is around those things? These are all the whats. They're not the whys. And what I would suggest is that if you focus on the what and not the why, you get empty rhetoric. And that's what actually contributes to this pendulum swing. And so I'm being a bit preachy about it quite deliberately because for me, our challenge is to really be clear about leading other educators that we're leading to really deeply consider the why. One of the challenges is, though, that's not a habit or a habit of mind, if you like, that we're used to because we're so used to being told what to do and to measure up. And I was in a school recently and someone was very excitedly taking me around the school. And they were really excited because every teacher in the school had the learning intentions written on the board. But no idea about, the kids had no real idea of why they were doing it, why they were doing the learning. And quite often I don't really want to write the learning intention on the board because I want them to be a surprise. And what sort of surprise am I going to get by the learning intentions that the kids discover in what we're doing? So I'm dismayed when I see this focus on the what rather than the why. So let me just try and explain the model a little bit more. And I'm going to step outside of a sort of a school or an education design, talk about a friend of mine in South Australia who's been responsible for the South Australian Teaching for Effective Learning Pedagogy Framework, or for leading that work. And Margot says to me, oh, Julia, I don't get your model, it's too abstract. Can you explain it to me again? They've built a house on the edge of Morialta Falls and at State Park, and it has lots of windows. I said, that's a practice. So tell me, why did you put in lots of windows? And she said, well, she didn't actually say it like this. She said, why? Because I value natural light. She didn't say I value it. She said, I like it. But essentially, she was telling me natural light was something she valued. I said, well, why do you value it? So what's the belief underpinning that? And we finally got to, because I feel better physically and psychologically when I'm bathed in lots of natural light, when I spend time in natural light. So, okay, got the reason now, we've got the belief underpinning it. So in principle, what does that mean? In principle, it means that you will ensure all your living spaces have lots of natural light. You chose to use lots of windows, but you could have done lots of other things. That's why I can't stand the term best practice, because there isn't one best practice. The best practice depends on the context at the time. So in their case, why was putting in lots of windows the thing to do rather than something else? Well, they actually also do have some large opening doors or shutters, just a couple. They could have also had glass bricks as walls. They could have had fewer walls. They could have had a glass roof. They could have had skylights. So why was it lots of windows and one large opening door and a shutter that they focused on? Well, where the house is built, it's on the edge of the state park and it's a very steep slope. So to have too many large opening doors and shutters or reducing the number of walls would have meant structural instability. So for them, that wasn't really an option, to keep reducing the number of walls and have it open. Why not glass bricks as walls? Because they have koalas in the gum trees, eucalypts right in front of them, that come and eat the green tips from their hands as they stretch out over the balcony. So glass bricks as walls wasn't going to work. So can't see the koalas. Number of walls wasn't going to work because of the structural support. The glass roof wasn't going to work because it's too bloody hot in Adelaide. And skylights, they couldn't afford them. So what they were reduced to, if you like, these two practices, lots of windows and opening doors or shutters. So getting away from the what, getting away from the so-called best practice, the best practice for them was to allow them to, in principle, have lots of natural light and to live in lots of natural light, but to do it in a way that was true to their context. So in terms of where I'm really coming from, I really want to get away from the term best practice to exemplary practice in a context. And I want it to be driven very deeply by what we actually value and believe. And why is it so important for the values and beliefs to be the driver of our leadership? Well, there are a couple of reasons for me that that's the case. If it was we were putting in let's just say that in your school you want to put in a 3D printer, or you want to put in another machine, like a better multi photocopier, laser printer, the whole works, as well as your 3D printer if you like. If you want to put those in place, just by the fact that you've changed the machine will actually change the quality of the work. But when it comes to what a human being does, so if I were to put down, let's improve the way we do X, Y, Z with kids as a practice, the only people who will actually change their practice are those who actually value and believe in that practice. Teaching is such an active person that unless you own it, unless you value it, unless you believe it, you won't enact it. So just saying putting learning intentions on the board is not actually what's going to make the difference in terms of the actual learning of the kids. So let me try and put it another way. This was probably the more dismaying one for me. The other story about the been there, done that happened in 1981. This one happened in 2015, and I was horrified. I was doing an exercise with a group of system leaders in Australia, whose date will remain nameless, and I asked them to think about times when they had witnessed learning that gave them a buzz. It's one of the ways I get to draw out people's values and beliefs about learning. And I got them to think about a time when they'd witnessed learning that really gave them a buzz. And then they were sharing the stories with each other. And as they shared the stories, the others were to draw out what values were implicit in those stories. When I went around, group after group of these system leaders weren't talking about learning at all. They were talking about teaching. They were talking about learning intentions and success criteria. I said, that's not learning, that's teaching. What do you do teaching for? You do it for learning. So what was the learning that you were witnessing that gave you a buzz? And they couldn't tell me. And what really worried me about that was, this is 2015, and it's the result of a lot of the work in Australia that's happened on focusing on quality teaching as if that's the be-all and end-all, not on focusing on the quality of learning. And so I'm going to flip through to picking up, so I go past that one now because I've already pulled that in. What I want to do is to actually come through to, probably for some of you, get underneath some of what's come through as being almost like the holy grail of teaching. If I look at some of John Hattie's work, and much as I like the fact that it is brought to the fore, things we should be thinking about as teachers as practices, that in itself is not going to take us forward. And I'll explain a couple of reasons why. The meta-analysis studies that John Hattie did were done on studies of academic performance, if you like, or achievement before 1990. That's before PISA, which has been an attempt to try and put academic achievement into a much broader application, problem-solving context. Well before that. So we're doing meta-analysis on, really in a way, what could have been valued as the stuff that Pedro was showing us this morning on the common C, the common core, or the, what's the answer? Give me a C. Oh, C's the answer. If you don't know, put a C. So choose C. So firstly, be wary, be critical, be thoughtful about what you're reading. But then also look at, okay, so yeah, good-o, it's brought attention to the effect size of feedback. But what sort of feedback? What feedback actually results in quality learning? So good that it's brought us attention to feedback and it's given us attention to things around some of our direct instruction, etc. And I'm not knocking that. But what it was really doing was putting a focus on 30% of the story. The difference in the outcomes for kids taken before 1990 were 30% of it was due to the kids. Sorry, due to the teachers. If you look at it more deeply, what you find is that, and I've changed around this order, sorry, was doing it deliberately and then I forgot to change the order or something. What you'll find is that if you look at what was involved with the kids here, their prior cognitive ability, which was actually how they went on the tests before, not really any true measure of cognitive ability, their disposition to learn and the effects of their peers all had pretty high effect sizes. But we all ignored that. And so it's almost like what had happened is we forgot about the kids. It was all about the teaching. Where I reckon our challenge is that 50% of the difference in outcomes comes from the kids themselves. So if I link back to David's talk, how are we harnessing that amazing energy and passion? I hear people say, oh, kids today can't concentrate. Baloney. How long does Hudson spend designing those cars? Can he concentrate? Of course he can concentrate when it's something he's passionate about. So how do we unleash this 50% that comes from the kids? How do we actually release their energy and excitement about learning? And so we focused on the 30% that came from teachers. Well and truly time that we unleash this 50% from the kids. So, and I'm probably a real pragmatist, a bit like Pedro. I know that much as I would love to live in a world where I could actually work with a group of kids and we could just sort of mentor their learning in a very free-spirited, almost homeschooling way, the reality is we've got a very big system and lots of kids to educate that don't all have the luxury of parents who can sit on their shoulder and mentor them. And so we have to actually worry about, at the moment, making sure we do have higher levels of academic achievement as well as developing 21st century capabilities. And that's where we unlock the learning potential of the kids. So for me, there is another way, and it goes back to the work that's come through in South Australia, which I'm jumping back to again. And this work that's gone on in South Australia, rather than having a quality teaching framework, they've actually had a quality learning framework for a number of years. And in that, it's about looking at what are the principles we need to put in place to create safe conditions for rigorous learning for the kids, to develop expert learners, help them learn to be learners, and to personalise and connect the learning. And the South Australian framework is all put in terms of principles around what to do to create these. So develop democratic relations, build a community of learners, negotiate learning, challenge students to achieve high standards with appropriate support, teach them how to learn, and then personalise and connect learning without going into that. But what I want to just suggest is that the work that's happened in some of the pilot schools in South Australia, where they've been helping kids learn that their brain is not fixed, their intelligence is not fixed, that they can actually learn to learn, along with focusing on all the elements or the principles of the South Australian framework, have actually shown that their traditional academic results are going up like that while they're engaged in far more holistic learning and far more student-driven learning. And so my encouragement to you is that you really need to unleash the potential of kids, and it really needs to be around a really clear understanding of what it is that you believe about learning and that they believe about learning. And so when I go from school to school and the focus is on, well, we're an inquiry school or we're this school or we're that school, my question would be why? Why do you want to have inquiry learning? And you say, well, it's obvious to you, you've just been talking about it. But really actually being able to articulate why you want inquiry learning and what that actually does. And so here's some examples that have come from a school where they value inquiry as an approach to learning because they believe that people are innately curious and curiosity is a prime motivator for learning. Through inquiry approaches to learning, they believe that learners are more motivated to find answers for their own questions, and learning naturally leads on to more questions and further learning. Learners take responsibility for their learning when it's something that's come from them. It fosters self-direction and independence. Individuals engage in learning at a level commensurate with their level of skill, encouraged to explore many ways of knowing. The process of learning is valued alongside the learning outcome or product. Learning is authentic, relevant, and contextualised. And learning is modelled as a process of inquiry rather than teacher telling. Now, if I put that up as the reasons why I want inquiry learning, then when I look at what's happening in a classroom, what I'm looking for is not whether the learning intentions are on the board, I'm looking to see if the learning intention's in the head. So if it says here learners are more motivated to find answers, we want to do it because we know if they have the question, they'll be more motivated. So whose question is it? I can go into classroom after classroom who say we're an inquiry school, and it's the teacher's question. It's just a new form of teacher-directed teaching, teacher-directed learning, if you like. In fact, it's not actually coming from the kids' questions at all. So I think this is where I probably come right back to link with where David's talk was, that really wrapped up in our understanding of learning is the power of learners to go forward themselves, and our role to mediate that, to guide it, to question it, to put resources at hand, to expose them to things they don't know they're exposed to, is really what our role becomes. And so if I really want to follow through on an inquiry learning model, I'll be really serious about making sure that infuse all learning with the spirit of inquiry. I'll be designing activities, learning spaces and resources to stimulate and support their inquiry, providing time and opportunities for student-directed inquiry, developing an inquiry community, critically evaluating what's going on in order to improve their skills and approaches, negotiating the learning goals with individuals, explicitly teaching skills that need explicit teaching for those who need it, not for everybody all at once, and provide formative feedback as learners apply inquiry approaches. So then I would know that if I've got my values and my beliefs articulated about why I want it, then everything I'm doing in practice is in response to my need to make sure that that's the learning that's happening. And so I don't focus on the practice, I focus on the belief, the principle that then says I should be enacting, and then whether what I'm doing in practice is actually living out the principle. And that's the challenge I guess I'm putting to you, is that unless you can really articulate why you're doing what you're doing as a leader, why you've got the practices you have in your school at the moment, then what you run the risk of is being part of the pendulum swing, not the solution to stopping it. On that note, I've sounded a bit soapboxy, but I think it's a really important time, especially with the world changing so rapidly, that we stop and really, as leaders, have the courage to go deep about what we're doing. Because when I found that I actually did that, in the old days when I was running a school, I had inspectors in those days. And when they came in and asked me to follow a rule or an expectation that they had, and I would ask them, why do you have that rule? E.g., none of you are from, well, some of you are from New South Wales, but not New South Wales Secondary. And at the time when I was in charge of a secondary school, they had a rule that you had to do 125 hours of maths in each year. They probably still have it in New South Wales. And I had to do 125 hours of maths. And I had a kid in year 8 who was not doing 125 hours of maths. She was doing everything else she could find in the community and whatever, because she was already working at a year 10 level of ability in maths. And so with the parents, we'd negotiated what her learning program was going to be. Inspector comes in and he says, you've got a kid in year 8 not doing 125 hours of maths. I said, that's right. And he said, well, you know that. And I said, yes, yeah, it's a deliberate thing, intentional, that she's actually doing what she's doing. We've negotiated with the parents. He said, Julia, but there's a rule, the board certificate rule that says, Board of Studies rule, that you have to do 125 hours of maths. And I said, well, why do you have that rule? And he said, well, they've got to meet the outcomes of the syllabus. Well, that was called objectives at the time. And you've got to meet the objectives of the syllabus. So I said, okay, so if Kayleen's met the objectives of the syllabus, then she doesn't have to do 125 hours of maths. That's correct, isn't it? That's correct logic. And he said, oh, well. So he was sort of acting from rules, but when you take people back to the deep underpinning principles and values underpinning it, they actually can't make you do things that are anti-learning. And that's what I guess my encourage to you is to just make sure you've thought out really deeply why you're doing it, and encourage your staff to do the same, so that we can stop as professionals being pushed around by a lot of the nonsense stuff that goes on outside of schools. I mean, what we do in schools is tremendous. We need to make sure we've been embedded in really deep values and beliefs, and that we have the courage to stand up to those and follow them through.